Gradients can be used in a number of ways to enhance your designs because they can be generated with code and they don't come with any kind of overhead and performance hit the same way that big images loading in or illustrations loading in. Not that those are bad things, but gradients have this superpower because they can be generated with code. So I want to look at the 3 ways that they can typically be used. Number 1, they can be used to create visual interest. If someone's ever asked you to make something pop or it needed to be jazzed up a bit, sometimes you can do that with a gradient. They can also be used for utility, fading things out or making smoother transitions from one thing to the next. And lastly, they can be used for interactivity. They can be used to create depth and to have the Z index of your screen kind of raised. They can kind of create these lighting effects. So first of all, let's take a look at a few examples for ways that they can be used to create visual interest. All right, good old classic Stripe.com. Well, check this out. They have this visually interesting gradient in the background, which is definitely kind of one of their branding staples. But what's interesting about visual interest, when it comes to visual interest, creating those with gradients, most of the time it's going to happen with analogous colors. So things that are close to each other on the spectrum. So if you're looking at the color wheel, it's going to be going from kind of a blue to a purple to this kind of lighter green. And anytime you're creating a gradient with complementary colors, like a red and a green, it has to travel through the literal gray area of the color spectrum to get into that color. So most of your visually interesting gradients are going to look the best if you're using analogous colors that don't go straight across the color wheel. And that's exactly what Stripe's done here with their purple to their blue to their green. The one thing you have to be careful though with these gradients, you have to check multiple colors to see if it passes accessibility. So I've got white as the foreground, and then if I'm checking this text, you can see, okay, great, this is AA, passes AA. But then if I come all the way over here to this really light minty blue, then that starts to fail. And if you check it kind of along the spectrum, you can see it's about AA large in the middle, and then over here on the darker color, you know, just because there's more contrast in this area than there is over here. So they can probably get away with this, but it does get into the failing zone of accessibility on this section. So that's one thing you have to be careful with when you're putting text on top of gradients. Okay, another example, let's take a look at this Exxon design system. You can see there's a very, very subtle gradient going from this darker red diagonally down to this lighter red. It's very, very subtle, but it gives it a little bit of kind of visual depth. And we took their brand colors and then just kind of added a lighter color. So they had this kind of brand dark red that was the Exxon red and the brand Exxon blue. And we added just a slight variation. I don't even think we changed the hue. It was more about changing just the brightness a little bit and maybe the saturation. But then that gave them the option to have this kind of darker blue going to the lighter blue if they wanted to use a blue header, or a darker red going down diagonally to this lighter red. And it's very, very subtle. And that allows them to create a little bit more of a variety in their internal applications without having to rely on any stock photography or images or illustrations. So it gives them a little bit more of an opportunity to add visual interest with just a little amount of code to generate these gradients. And you can also see that we're using them in this kind of call to action here for the search. And on down here, you can see some of these buttons right in here. You can see that some of these larger primary actions, just to kind of keep that theme going, we're bringing this gradient across in some of the primary calls to action. All right, here's an old project of mine where this was a timer called Timer Plus, and you could set these timers and you could name them. And I was playing around with this idea of bringing this timer, instead of going to a full circle, it was just going to go into this kind of semicircle that went all the way across. And I thought it would be cool to use this gradient. And then if you were editing the time, I thought it would be cool to carry this gradient idea down into selecting the time. So you're going between hours and minutes and seconds. Now, this design does have some probably readability issues, some contrast issues. This was several years ago. So not my best work, but it does show you I'm still using this blue and purple, and I didn't even know about analogous gradients at the time. I just chose something that I thought looked good. It just so happened that the ones that looked best were these analogous gradients. And if you look at page 2, you can see that I'm also experimenting with this kind of green to blue and this kind of orange to red, these different color schemes that you could choose. But if you look right here, this green to red, or green to pink rather, this is getting pretty muddy right in here. Now, it's not to say that you couldn't use this for anything, but this is a good example of a color spanning across the color wheel to get to its complementary color, and that results in some kind of blurry, muddy, kind of grayish, not that saturated and clean of a gradient. One more example of a very subtle, visually interesting gradient was on this particular prototype called Late Shift. This was kind of a survey. So I've got this darker blue that kind of goes down to this dark purple. And then I've got this extremely contrasty pink button on top of it, which is not a true complementary color, but it's, you know, they are analogous colors, but they're further apart. So it has a really nice, kind of goes with the color, but on the color wheel, it's kind of down in the, almost like a triad quadrant. And so I'm just using this very, very subtle hue shift and this white and the pink on top of that gradient to kind of create this really rich interaction. But gradients can be trendy. They were really trendy with old iOS work. And we had this big shift to flat colors only. But now you're starting to see gradients kind of sneaking back in here and there. So you need to use these wisely, use them with restraint. And sometimes it can be a branding question or just a design direction in general. Before you go experimenting with these too much, you need to ask yourself, is this the type of project that's going to have and use a lot of gradients? Or are we going to stick to kind of flat colors? And so you almost need to set the direction up front of what you want to go for before you start going too crazy with all the gradients. And one last visually interesting thing you can do with gradients is kind of create this spotlight effect. So if you look at these FiberStream designs, you can see this very, very subtle radial gradient in the background here. And it almost looks like there's a dark surface and someone shined a flashlight onto the surface, and it's only kind of a very soft light is hitting the surface. So it kind of makes it have this dimension, this floor that's actually inside of the image. And if you look down here at these routers, you can see it almost looks like there's a spotlight on each one of these. And if you look at the actual shape, you can see there's a radial gradient on the actual background. And so I've got it the same exact color, 333, going all the way to a 0% 333 to kind of create that effect. So you can see if I brought that all the way up, it's gonna fade to the same color, but I want the background to bleed through. So I went from a 0% to 100% of the same color, and then that created the radial gradient. And you do have to kind of be mindful of the size of the gradients when you're working on these, because you can see if I went crazy with this, it wouldn't work. But I have just enough to where the gradient 0% is ending before the edge of the shape. And I've got the position in just the right spot below the router so it has the shadow. And if you actually look hard at these, I actually created these routers with nothing but shapes and gradients and a couple of kind of inner shadows, bevels, but I'll get into how to create something like this with gradients and shadows later on in some of the style lessons. But for now, I just want to show you a variety of ways to create visually interesting things with some simple gradients. All right, so now let's take a look at the way that you can use gradients for utility's sake. Now, if we look back at this red camera concept, you can see right in here on this product info, this kind of gradient fade out. This is a great way to create a little bit of depth and kind of give the impression that more information is below there. Now you could imagine if this gradient was gone and I just did a ... and the more button was maybe right here, that would still be okay to use. But adding this kind of gradient in here just gives it a little bit more depth and maybe a little bit more interest, specifically for this kind of concept, this dark concept. It kind of adds that depth, and it adds maybe a little bit of mystery because things are fading out. Just gives it a little bit more visual appeal. And so even though we're not really trying to go for full-on visual interest, although it is creating that interest, it's really used as a utility to say, hey, there is more to the story here. And it's an easy way to kind of hide that text. And if we really wanted to, you know, we could do this at any point. So if we deleted that, if we had a certain character constraint, we could move this gradient up and have this right in here. Move your more button up there. And the same exact thing was done here. And the way that you create these utility gradients is you simply have the same hex code or HSB value. In this case, it's white, going to pure white. The part that you want to fade out is 0%, whereas the part that you have fading is 100%. And as long as that is the same hex code as the background, then it's going to work out. Another example of that is on the Shift Nudge website, where I have all of these modules laid out and I have the course lessons kind of listed below. But when I first laid this out and everything was kind of laid out, it just felt kind of overwhelming. So I wanted to show all of the lessons, but I also wanted it to not be overwhelming. So I used the same exact technique here. So I'm using an actual gradient overlay on these to just indicate that there is possibly more there. And I didn't even use the more button because I kind of was going out on a limb thinking, well, maybe someone will tap on these because it looks like there's more. It will create interest, which will create action. I think this is just a very, very simple way to kind of fade things out and to smooth over a little bit of that transition. So if you look at this example, we've got kind of this main video area here, but we're also incorporating some text and a share icon. So whenever you're using text on top of images, you never really know what image that someone might use, especially if this is used for like a content management system. So look what happens when I take off my overlay. So all of a sudden I'm getting tons of image bleed through onto my text. There's no way that I can reliably have my contrast be at a certain level, especially if I were to get some kind of image that came in really bright white and it would just completely shatter the text. And most of the time, adding a drop shadow on text is not really going to look that great. So if we were to go here and say, okay, let's put a big shadow on our text, that would definitely make it readable, but it also just doesn't look good. It doesn't really look that good. There are sometimes some ways that you can possibly make it work where it's very, very subtle, but you're typically gonna wanna do that with the addition of a gradient. So if I remove this shadow completely and bring back in these images, let's see, let's go to this one again. So you can see this simple overlay right here. So now if I remove all of these images, you can see the overlay in effect. So this utility gradient, it's going from, looks like I've got 80% black here. It is the same hex code transitioning to the same hex code, just at different opacity values. So if I bring back the images, I'm also playing with the exact position because I don't want it to fade out here because then I wouldn't have enough overlay with the image. So I have the gradient starting up here. And now I know if I pull this handle, this 80%, I know that everything here is going to have an 80% black overlay. And so even on a white photo, I'm guaranteed to have a passing contrast score of 15. So it's going to be very, very noticeable. And so I could have even brought that down darker, but that's just kind of it seemed like 80% was a good opacity stop for that. So these types of utility gradients can be very helpful to create these environments where your text can still work, even if there's an unpredictable image in the background. Another really cool way to use these kind of utility gradients, let's say you're in Figma and you want to have a big image for your header of your site or app, something like that. So I'm just gonna pick this random photo, and let's actually pull in one more just to show two different examples. I've already got this Unsplash plugin installed, so I'm just choosing a colorful photo here. And that one's mostly black, but let's do another one because that one's a little too similar. Let's do one more, and we'll do 3 of these. Hopefully we get an actual really colorful one. Okay, fine, that'll work. Actually, you know what? Let's cut that, go undo a couple times, and then paste this one back in. There we go. All right, so let's check this out. Let's put these all on their own frame. I'm gonna hit Command Option G while these are selected. Then I can extend this frame. Let's actually extend these frames. No, that's not gonna work. All right, pulling these frames down. And I'm gonna give them all a white background to kind of pretend that these are almost like the top of our website. So starting with this one, let's actually just go ahead and I'm just gonna Option drag this down just so I have a rectangle that's the same size. And let's remove the image fill and let's add a gradient fill. Let's see, what do we wanna fade this out to? So we could technically, if we wanted this background of the website to be a kind of a dark color like this, then we would want our gradient to be the same color as the background. So we want that to be there. And we also want our 0% value to be there. So now I can use this shape and let's start going in and adjusting. We actually want the full color to be down at the bottom and we want the 0% opacity to be at the top. And let's just see here. I also want to make sure that this one is there. Okay, that one is there. I think I made the wrong one at the top. So we want our 0% of it to be at the top and 100% at the bottom. And now we just want to make sure that the gradient bottom edge is aligned with that photo bottom edge. And then let's get back in here. See, our 0% is extending too far past the top. So we want to make sure that the 0% is below that background. You can pull it further down here. Just as long as it doesn't extend past, it'll be fine. And you can even pull this one up if you wanted. If you didn't want to see that kind of sidewalk stuff in the grass that looks maybe a little dirty, we could bring this up a little. So all of a sudden, we have this kind of cool orange and concrete image that is seamlessly fading into the background. And we could either export this entire thing as an asset for the web, or we could export this image as its own asset. And this could be in its own little div container on top of the image. That way, no matter what image you brought in here, so even if I brought this one in, I could still use the same overlay and fade out any image that we put in here. This one doesn't work quite as well just because the image is kind of it's very colorful at the very bottom, whereas this one wasn't. But you could still make it work. Even with something like this, super bright, you could still fade that out. It's not, see, this one doesn't work quite as well. This one would work a lot better if we're fading to a white background. So if I bring this gradient over here and I align that to the bottom, but even that could work. So if you wanted to put some type right in here that was on top of the image, that white type is not gonna work on here, but it would work down here. But let's just say we wanted to fade that out to white. We could very quickly, very easily change these to all white. And we have a pretty nice fade out there. So we can play with this. We could play with the actual height of this. Maybe this little quasi thorn isn't fully visually interesting. Well, maybe we would want to bring up the gradient to get that to be covered up. So like right in there, maybe. And we could also experiment with making this a radial gradient. But we need to make sure our white is on the outside. Okay, it is. And then if we're gonna make this a radial gradient, then this needs to be kind of fully up here. Then we can kind of play with, okay, we want this to be kind of right in the image. And then we want this radial gradient to kind of, as long as we're not hitting and seeing this hard edge, we can play with the radial gradient and the position of that radial gradient to get it in just the right spot to where now this really cool flower image is fully fading out in kind of this rounded fashion. So even right here where the blue would normally be, and if I bring this back in and toggle this, you can see where it's fading it out. So it's just kind of a cool way to put this kind of vignette around an image. And if we go back to this one, we could even say, man, what if the background for this website was this kind of cool purple color, and then we use this same linear gradient to handle that. I'm gonna grab that color and this color, and we'll make the top one 0. Whoops, grab the wrong one. 0% there. So maybe this one doesn't work quite as well because there's not as much color, but you kind of have to play with a combination of what does the photo look like, what does the gradient look like, play with a couple different options. But this is a really great way to use gradients as a utility. And you saw you can use this for fading out text, you can use this for fading out images. And look at this Exxon example again. Here's an example of where I'm using this very, very subtle, probably like a 40% black to a 0% black to indicate this mobile table that you can swipe over, and there's more that you can view here. Now there's a number of different ways that you can show that there's more content available, but the same way that we're fading out that text on the read more for the red camera stuff, we can use that same thing here to fade out these lines and the cells. And it's just kind of a very easy way to add that little bit of utility, that little bit of affordance that lets you know that there is more there. You can see that Spotify is even using this same technique here with all of their artist headers. They're taking this big image and they've got this programmatic gradient back here to fade to their background color. And then they're using the same thing in reverse as you scroll. See, very, very slowly, they're starting to bring in the gradient in the top. So they're bringing in the gradient in the top that will ultimately turn into the entire background for that header. So it's very, very subtle. When you get the hang of using these utility gradients, it's very, very powerful. And the beauty of this is it's all generated with code. I'm using the exact same utility gradient on this Intro to Icons website where I've got this full video, but I wanted there to be more contrast on the text, but I didn't want to do this fully big overlay. So I'm just using this like 80, 90% black fading up to maybe 50% black. So you can play with both values to kind of set things further back in the background or to let them bleed through into the foreground. And you can see on this side as well, I'm using a big radial gradient right here behind these little animated paper things. Same thing here. I've got a big radial gradient behind this computer just to add a little bit more of this spotlight effect. And finally, you can use these same types of gradients for adding depth and dimension to buttons. Now again, this is something that you'll have to make a decision on whether or not your buttons and your styles in general for your project are gonna use gradients, because it's definitely can be trendy. It can be subject to someone's personal opinion, whether or not flat colors or gradient colors are gonna look better. But if you end up using gradients, this is a great way to do it. So this button, for example, this shows kind of an analogous gradient where I've got, let's go to our HSB values so we can do this more clearly. So at the very top, you can see I've got 220, 80, and 100. And then at the very bottom, I'm going 260, 80, and then 90. So I could have left that at 100, but I wanted the bottom to look a little bit darker. Typically, if you're gonna have this on a button, you want it to look like your top color is lighter than your bottom color, because light comes from the top. Same way that if I were to grab my backlight here, you know, if all of my videos look like this, it would be pretty creepy. And so sometimes it can be kind of creepy to have light coming from the actual bottom, unless there's a very specific reason to do that. So in general, light comes from the top. I'll cover a lot more of this in the style section. But when you're creating gradients, especially for buttons, a lot of times it can be most helpful to have your lighter color on top, slightly darker color on the bottom. And you know, it kind of works well. You could have a very simple layout with a button like this. But if you wanted to, you could also use the kind of utility gradient where I've got my flat color here, just a simple 3377FF, trusty blue color there. But I wanted to add a little bit of extra spice to it with this little gradient. So what I've done here is I've got a black color at 0% at the top, and I've added 20% at the bottom. So you can see if I really cranked this up, we'd have 100 going to 0 at the top going to 100, and that would just be too much. You really have to have some subtlety in your gradients for them to actually work. You could even do 10%. It might be kind of hard to perceive that, but you could also have this at 10% on regular, and then as you roll over, maybe it goes to 20%. I had the wrong one selected. So there's some different things that you could play with in terms of utility gradients and adding this kind of interactivity. Same way with these checkboxes. You can see here I've just added a very similar, almost utility gradient. I've got grayish color. Let's look at the hex code. Well, you can look at the saturation. This is 92 saturation. Actually, this is brightness. So instead of going 100 brightness like white would be, I've just gone down to 90. I think I have this at 92. Kind of want just a little bit of contrast between the border and the gradient. If I went the same value as the border, that could look a little weird. It doesn't look horrible, but I did want just a little bit of difference between there. So going up to like 93-ish or so. And this just kind of makes it look like, because our light is coming from the bottom and the dark part is at the top, it makes it feel like it's set back a little bit, like it can be checked. But then if we check the icon, then we want the light coming from the top and the darkness at the bottom to make it look like it's been activated. You can see if I change this gradient around, if I moved this dark color to the top and this light color to the bottom, it could technically still work because it looks like the color has been indented. But if we did that, we might want to rotate these colors to make it look like it was an actual button. So maybe in this case, we would want that to feel like it was stuck out of the page just a little bit, and we're kind of manipulating the z-index with a gradient. And again, this is a very, very, very subtle gradient. And then we are making the check box look like it's sunk into the page with just these simple little gradients. Lots and lots of things that you can do with gradients, especially when it comes to utility, with interactivity, and even adding visual interest. So just a couple of pro tips just to kind of hammer in the points. If you're trying to just create visual interest, you're working on marketing sites or things like that, you have a little bit more leeway with your values from transitioning from blue to purple or green to blue, things like that. But if you're trying to get into the utility function with the 0 to 100% gradients, or even the buttons and interactivity, you want to use those very, very, very subtly. So you don't want to go overboard with your gradients with interactivity and utility, whereas you have a little bit more opportunity to do that in the kind of visually interesting kind of way. So for homework, for your gradients, I want you to take a look at the sketch icon right here. So I'm going to go ahead and take a screenshot of that, and we're going to paste it into our design tool. And it's got a lot of cool gradients in here. So I want you to go ahead and recreate this shape. So you can just draw a rectangle, hit return, delete that point, connect the existing points with Command J, and then you can kind of manipulate this over here. And we're going to add a fill, and then you could bring this shape over here, add a linear gradient, and we're going to make the gradient go from here to here, and we're gonna use our selection tool. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just to get an idea of how we can create this visually interesting thing with gradients. So I'm gonna duplicate that. Shift H will flip it, and then you can see you can probably use the pen tool or something else to get in here You could even use rectangles and masks, whatever is the easiest way for you to do this. And then take that shape, add the linear fill, and just use the dropper to start creating these gradients. You can see how incredibly subtle this gradient is. It goes from this kind of orange down to this yellowy color. You could also adjust your little shapes to line up a little bit better. So for the first exercise, let's just recreate the sketch icon or any other icon that you might want to do. I just chose the sketch icon because it's just some simple triangles. And secondly, let's recreate the stripe background. Same thing, let's create a rectangle just like this and choose all of the different colors that they chose for their background images. You can do it straight across to begin with. That's going to be a little bit easier. And then maybe after that, you could rotate them, whatever's easiest, just something that kind of gets your gradient usage going. I just want you to kind of experiment. And once you've created the stripe one, you could create a different one that's completely different gradients. Maybe you create your own pattern similar to the stripe header example. And then once you've got your stripe header, I want you to go ahead and create a utility gradient that goes from 0% to 100% and apply that to the text on any of your old projects that might have been your typography homework or any body of text that you've created for any of your older projects. Go ahead and try to apply a little utility gradient that kind of fades that out just so you can start playing with it. Make sure your hex code for the background is the same as the hex code for your utility gradient. And then also take one of your old projects and try slapping a gradient on one of the buttons, whether it's an analogous gradient or a slightly kind of overlaid utility gradient on top of a flat color. So a variety of gradients for you to create. So get started, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.